The category is What the Trans, Darling?
Hello, and welcome to What the Trans.
What the Trans? Our 1 week break became 2.
It kind of did, and so we are sorry about that, particularly if you just signed up on Patreon and then we actually didn't do anything for a couple of weeks. There were a few things going on, though, which I think, we're about to get into. How are you, Michelle?
I'm good. I've had a particularly strange couple of weeks, not only because the police shot an actual terrorist outside my local Boots, which was a lot, but also what was really strange about that was that it cleared up so quickly. I went to the shops in the day after, just down the road from where it happened. For people that don't know what I'm talking about, there was a whole thing in Streatham in London where a guy who started, like a Islamic fundamentalist nightmare job, was started to stab people in the street, and the police shot him because he was wearing a fake bomb vest. That's the kind of thing that happens when you live in a big city. I'm fine, I'm not worried about it. But the thing that struck me the most was when I went to the shops and it was just another day. And people were talking about just like, oh, did you hear about that thing? Yeah. And it was just like, oh, have you heard about what Barry's been doing? Oh, I know, right? Barry, Jesus. He can't stop collecting pogs or something. Like, it was just everyday conversation straight away. So, but that was a strange thing. But then the thing that was probably had the bigger effect on me was that I was diagnosed with ADHD. And if anybody who's been following on the Twitter will know that I asked for money to crowdfund an assessment. And thanks to the kindness of you lovely listeners, I was able to do that and I got the diagnosis. I am currently on day 2 of medication. So this is like my first show done medicated. I'm already seeing a lot of benefits. Like when I was working on my parts of the script, I actually finished them early today, which never happens.
I wasn't going to say it, but...
Yeah, Ashley can attest to this. Almost every time we arrange like a recording time and then I have to go, Ashley, I need another half hour.
In fairness, sometimes I do too, because sometimes life gets in the way. However, obviously, immediately before you crowdfunded for the session that you went to and so on, you know, you and I had discussed it and sort of you'd raised the possibility of there perhaps being a diagnosis, and my thinking was, oh, good heavens, how surprised I'm not.
Yeah, it's very much a thing where everyone I've worked a job with in the past, they were just like, yeah.
Yeah, what took you so long?
Exactly. And to that I say, I don't know. Nobody talks about ADHD stuff. It's very easy to go through your whole life with that kind of thing hanging over your head, and then you can build a lot of shame around it, and it can really spiral out of control. So,
not to mention, even here in the UK, where we ostensibly have socialised healthcare, you get on a waiting list to be diagnosed with something, and you're waiting for, 18 months or something? So
it was going to be 2 years for me. They said it was going to be 12 to 18 months, but then they kind of screwed up my referrals, so it became 2 years, and what with Brexit on the horizon, and I've already been out of work for so long, sitting at home on benefits and stuff. It was just like, I can't face another 2 years of waiting. So thank you for saving me from that 2 years of utter hell, of uncertainty and waiting, that I honestly don't know if I would have been able to hack it. So I genuinely mean this. Thank you so much to the people that donated. Thank you to the people that shared it. This is genuinely a life-changing thing for me. And hopefully it will reflect in the work that I do on the show, and probably will. Well, I'm pretty sure that Ashley will thank you as well. So yeah, that's been me. But what have you been doing, Ashley?
What have I been doing? Well, kind of more of the same. It's all been terribly boring and depressing and cold. So so there have been some exciting things, but I'm not allowed to talk about them yet. Sorry, this is actually as the sort of secret agent thing again.
Yeah, they don't have a chapter in the podcasting manual on how to do a podcast with someone who might be a spy.
I am not a spy.
That's exactly what a spy would say.
Yeah. God damn it. Hoist by my own petard. No, but as in sort of activist-y, project-y things, one of which I have spoken about before. There are developments, but those developments are not yet in the public domain, and we're going to be talking about those things once everything's been a bit more firmed up. Because at the moment we're still planning, okay, we'll do this and this and this, but nothing's been announced yet, so I'm not going to talk about it.
That's absolutely fine. But when you are able, obviously, the exclusive is here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be one of those things where it'll be like, and now, to talk about the Trans Learning Project, we throw to an interview with Ashley Talbot. Hi, Michelle. Thanks for letting me come on the show. Right, let's crack on, shall we?
Yeah, let's do some terrible news, the segment where we talk about all of the goings-on in the UK and further on when it comes to trans stuff. And we're going to start with last time, which was 2 weeks ago. We talked a fair bit about the Labour leadership contest that is going on, because whoever they pick is going to probably be our best bet in kicking out the Tories in 5 years' time. So we should probably get into the latest goings on from that, and it is mostly good. On the 26th of January, at an open Labour hustings, Labour leadership contenders Rebecca Long-Bailey, Emily Thornberry and Lisa Nandy all said that they believe trans men are men, trans women are women, and that they support GRA reform and trans rights in general. Keir Starmer himself was not present at the hustings as he has been dealing with some personal family issues, but has previously stated his support for trans equality and GRA reform. So as it stands, on the whole, all four of the current candidates have our backs to varying degrees, and we'll get onto the varying degrees in a moment. Since then, an independent group of trans and non-binary members of the Labour Party, calling themselves the Labour Campaign for Trans Rights, has released a list of 12 pledges for the party to sign up for, which includes pledges to accept the material reality of trans people as an oppressed minority, to commit to respecting trans people's identities, and to call out transphobia and organise and fight against transphobic organisations such as Women's Place UK, LGB Alliance, and other trans exclusionist hate groups. So far, deputy leadership contenders Angela Rayner and Dawn Butler have signed up, no surprise there. As has leadership contenders Rebecca Long-Bailey, Lisa Nandy and Emily Thornberry. However, Emily Thornberry's statement on her signing of the pledges comes with a big fat stinking caveat. In her statement, she says she has voiced concern over the use of the term hate group in the pledges that refer to the LGB Alliance and Women's Place UK. In the statement she says, "We need to keep in mind that at the heart of the debates, Twitter hashtags and groups forming to give their views on trans rights, at the heart of all of this are human beings who are often more vulnerable to attacks and abuse and who often face a difficult journey with many challenges. What they need is our support, not a debate about their existences. But to ensure everyone understands this and offers their support to the trans community, we mustn't shout down people and we mustn't call people hate groups. We must have a respectful discussion with education on trans rights, on the facts around violence against women and girls, and on safeguarding. The fight to protect women and girls and the fight to support trans people are not opposed. They are the same fight and we must do it together." Obviously, she has a point insofar as making the case for trans equality should attempt to start from a place of mutual respect in many cases. But the simple fact is that if you take the Southern Poverty Law Centre's definition of a hate group, which is an organisation that, based on its official statements of principles, the statements of its leaders or its activities, that has beliefs or practices that attack or malign an entire class of people, typically for their immutable characteristics, then Women's Place UK and the LGB Alliance absolutely count as hate groups. Arguing that we shouldn't point out a hate group when we see it right in front of us is clearly the wrong move.
Indeed.
The only leadership candidate who hasn't signed the pledges is Keir Starmer at the time of recording. However, he has signed pledges released by LGBT plus Labour that included supporting trans rights, reforming the Gender Recognition Act, and campaigning on reducing waiting times for trans people seeking NHS treatments. We are currently reaching out to his people to get clarification on why he hasn't signed the pledges from the Labour campaign for trans rights, and we'll let you know when we hear something back. But earlier today, I sat down with Tor, a non-binary Labour activist, who is one of the architects of the Labour campaign for trans rights, to get an inside look on how all this came about. Let's play the tape. Hello, Tor. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So what made you decide to put this campaign together?
I mean, it wasn't just me. It was a sort of, I guess, collective, if you like, of trans Labour members who felt that we had to do something soon to change the way things are going in the party and in Britain more widely. I think what spurned it was that last year, which has continued into this year, that we've started seeing motions passed in support of Women's Place UK, which is, we feel at least, a transphobic hate group. And so seeing that was very disheartening to us. The Labour manifesto was quite equivocal on trans rights and trans liberation. There was obviously a commitment to reform the Gender Recognition Act, but there was some other sort of questionable and quite vague language about sort of single-sex spaces and some stuff about sort of the cultural shift required. So we sort of, what we did was we kind of put our organising on hold to the election, and then when we saw that in the manifesto, I think it did dishearten us more, and then the election result disheartened us even further, because maybe, as many problems as Labour has, it's better than the Tories on this, and it sort of hit home that we're now going to have 4 or 5 years of basically transphobes in government, and no policies, no reform Gender Recognition Act that might alleviate our situation. And also just sort of generally the sort of press attacks and so on have been ramping up so much. over the past 2 or 3 years. So I think that's what gave us all the sense that we had to do something.
So are you surprised at the response it has had? It has gone far and wide at this point at time of recording. It has been reported on in so many different mainstream papers and stuff. You've had some pretty big names in the party sign on.
Yeah. I mean, I never really knew exactly how successful it would end up being, but I was organising with the ambition, the sort of realistic ambition, that it would be quite big and that it would be the start of something that would be even bigger than what we've done so far. I didn't quite expect the level of attention we've had in such a concentrated period. I thought it might be a bit of a slower process over the course of the leadership contest. So it's been quite amazing to see such a positive response open up so rapidly to what we've done. And I think it sort of shows that the time was very opportune and that a lot of people, not just trans people, but trans allies as well, feel that something had to be done.
So has Keir Starmer been in contact with you about why he hasn't signed?
Keir Starmer personally certainly, as far as I know anyway, we haven't been reached out to from him or his team. We are hoping to speak to someone from his team, and the invitation very much remains open. So we'd be really happy to sit down with him or representatives of him and his campaign to discuss, the issues that are important to trans people and what our campaign seeks to accomplish. And we'd really like to have that conversation with him.
Do you think Emily Thornberry is right to criticise the labelling of the LGB Alliance and Women's Place UK as hate groups?
So we do genuinely really welcome the fact that she has signed our pledges. That's really the most important thing. We think that she is supporting our pledges, and it now means that all of the women who are running in this race, obviously 3 out of 4 of the candidates are women in this race, are supporting our pledge and our pledges and our statement. I think it demonstrates the fact that this claim that is often made by transphobes that cisgender women are on their side isn't really true. It doesn't bear out in reality. Most cisgender women aren't really on their side. They're a small minority who are just very organised and vocal. So we really do welcome the fact that Emily has signed them. We think it is absolutely right to describe Women's Place and LGB Alliance as transphobic hate groups. They are organisations which were set up and exist solely for the purpose of limiting any improvement in transgender rights and rolling back the rights that we do have. That is essentially their stated purposes. I don't think there's any legitimacy to the idea that they're just sort of generalised women's rights or LGBT rights groups, because this is all the only issue that they campaign on. I think it would be right in most cases to describe any organisation whose existence is defined by opposing the rights of a marginalised group as essentially a hate group, a group that's built on hatred towards a given marginalised group. So we absolutely believe that's the correct definition for them. We maintain that they don't have any place in the Labour Party. We maintain that, as a matter of fact, as they exist currently, that those who express support for them don't have any place in the party as per our own equalities policy, which states that any discrimination on the basis of gender identity is against the party rules, essentially. So we completely stick by that. We don't think it should be controversial, frankly.
So what's next for the campaign? How can any trans people who are listening who are Labour members get involved?
So we have a lot of stuff that we're working on. This is a long-term campaign. We're in this for a long haul. We think this is going to be a long fight for trans liberation. It was a long fight for gay and lesbian liberation for cis people, and it will be a long fight for us. We're going to be, I think, firstly working on growing the organisation, trying to get as many trans, non-binary, intersex, and all gender diverse people, involved in this struggle for our rights. We need more people to get active and get organised. So I suppose I'd like to issue a call to any trans and non-binary people listening to this. I really, really encourage you to get involved and to join our campaign, join the Labour Party if your political inclinations are that way, and fight for your liberation, fight for your rights, because that is the only way we will ever get them. But we're going to be setting up, hopefully soon, regional groups, which will obviously have more of a physical presence. We're going to start getting organised more and more in CLPs. We're hoping to get motions passed that will be in support of the Labour campaign for trans rights, and we're going to be bringing up pledges to CLPs and asking people to sign, maybe people who aren't as online as many other people are, so that people, have a real presence on the ground. I think that's really important, because this is one thing that organisations like Women's Place have been quite good at, is winning that ground war. So we have to really come back on that. But we've got other plans as well, like we're hoping to really develop a set of policies, basically, that would be massively helpful for trans and non-binary people. So that's things like how we could change actual proper trans healthcare to people, have a housing policy, employment policy, workers' rights, all of these things that massively affect trans people right now and cause us a huge amount of suffering and misery. We're hoping to start developing policies written by trans people to actually solve these problems. So again, that's something that we're hoping as many people as possible will inform us on their experiences and what they think we should do. If you have ideas, if you have things you'd like to see happen, get involved and tell us what they are, and we'll work on it.
All right, and there will be links in the description, so you can definitely go and do all of those things if you are interested in the Labour Party. Tor, thank you very much for talking to me.
No worries. Thank you for having me on.
Now, on the 12th of February, the hashtag #ExpelUs was started on Twitter by transphobic maybe members of the Labour Party who did not at all like the sounds of these pledges, but especially the correct labelling of the LGB Alliance and Women's Place UK as hate groups. At its height, it was the top trending political hashtag on the platform in the UK and was about as fun as you would expect, and as such, the mainstream media began reporting on this as a fight inside the Labour Party. And pretty much all of the coverage of the pledges was framed through the lens of what cis people think, because of course it did. It always fucking does. It's always about fucking cis people when it comes to trans stuff. Anyway, that's not scripted. I should stick to the script and stop ranting. Naturally, all the candidates have maintained their support for the trans community in so many words. So overall, we are pretty confident that the next leader of the Labour Party has our backs, but to varying degrees. So, Ashley, what's your take on all of this stuff?
I mean, there's kind of a lot to get caught up on with this, isn't there? There's a lot to take in. I would say I found it quite interesting when earlier today, February 13th, LGBT Labour, which is, as the name suggests, it's the LGBT group within Labour, which we know that Tor has been involved with previously. They actually released their own set of pledges. There was 12 or 13 of them, and the final one was LGBT Labour should be the, unified voice of the LGBT community within the Labour Party, which to me seemed like a bit of a subtle dig. It seemed a little bit like, oh, we can't have these, trans people speaking up for themselves. No, they have to go through corporate. And I thought that was quite interesting. And it's like, well, if you want to stop trans people from actually campaigning and, doing stuff and trying to make things change, then you've got to put the fucking work in, all right? Don't just say, oh, we support trans people, we pledge this and that, the other trans people, and then don't do anything about it or ignore it or have one of your shadow cabinet ministers say nobody cares about trans people, which was another thing that happened in the last couple of days, just while we're here. So please don't get pissy when a group of people decide that they are going to do the work to make the changes that you can't be arsed with, cis people. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought that was a bit strange when I read that, but I think I'm in a place where I'm willing to, give them the benefit of the doubt for now, only because LGBT plus Labour have done some things in the past that have been very, very good for trans people, and they're a damn sight better than the LGBT conservatives, although, to be fair...
It's kind of an oxymoron, that, isn't it? LGBT conservatives, it's like government organisation or military intelligence. It's just a contradiction in terms.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that isn't where the bar is.
I was a little bit concerned by Thornbury's statement, wasn't it? Because it kind of smacked of that whole centrist... we have to consult with both sides, and it's like, I really don't think that you do, actually, given the kind of evidence and the rhetoric that currently exists and the way that these people actually feel the need to talk and gang up on people, particularly on social media, but, not entirely. But then to say, we have to pander to these people and not call them hate groups, it's like, come on, call a spade a spade. You're supposed to be in the Labour Party, for fuck's sake.
Yeah, exactly. It was just like I just said, Emily Thornberry, I kind of respect her in that she is right on the money when it comes to being respectful in the conversation to a point. I think that is very true. But there's a difference between being respectful of other people's views that may be on the surface transphobic views, but they do not come from a place of hate. I think there is a distinction to be made, whereas the LGB Alliance and Women's Place UK are hate groups. They fit they fit the classical determination of that.
And they're not the only ones, are they? There's been several others. There was Man Friday, there was...
Fair Play for Women and all sorts.
Oh, Transgender Trend. Sorry, I forgot about that.
Now I remembered them. Thanks for that.
Sorry.
But and we've also got in big Christian groups like Christian Voice, where they seem to have really doubled down on the transphobic stuff, as if they were just all right, we lost the gay thing. What's next?
Pretty much, yeah.
How else are we going to justify our existence and ply our members for donations? But Anyway, not meaning to imply anything untoward.
No, far from it.
To our friends in the bigoted bastard groups. But anyway, I was quite disappointed that Keir Starmer has failed to sign up to the pledge himself, but I do want to say that his wife's mum did just pass away.
Yeah, so Keir Starmer's probably got a lot on at the moment. So
yeah, that could very much be a factor, but we will be chasing that up because I would like to see if that is the case. That's just speculation from me, and maybe a little bit of naivety, possibly. I don't know.
I mean, that's just kind of speculating on a politician's personal life, and it's so that's the thing that's happened that we're aware of. So I am sure there will be further developments on this as the Labour leadership election rumbles along, because it's not done now, is it? There's several more weeks of this.
Yeah, and we will keep you all up to date as and when trans stuff comes out, but honestly, I don't think that trans stuff is going to be a big part of their campaigns. I think that this stuff has come up because they have been asked questions in the media, they've been asked questions at hustings, and now because of the current media landscape that seems to be fucking obsessed with us right now, it's become a much bigger story than maybe it should have been. Like, this is a big deal for the trans community. All of the leadership candidates are on some level on our side. That's a huge thing for us. Not really that big of a deal for anybody else.
Yeah, pretty much. So, however, given that this is something that's potentially progressive, potentially could usher in some changes in the House of Commons and the Labour Party and so on, it is something that I feel we should pay attention to. So that is what we are doing.
Yeah, so keep your eyes here. We will let you know when more stuff happens.
So moving on then, and before we get to the final part of the show, which is of course the meat, we are going to have another little round of our not nearly infrequent enough segment that we like to call turf-based twattery.
Boo hiss.
Boo. Yeah, absolutely. Quite. So to start with, Mayor of Manchester Andy Burnham, who we actually spoke to a few months ago, got into some hot and hateful water when the LGB Alliance, who is one of the aforementioned anti-trans hate groups who are masquerading as an LGBT rights group, posted on their Facebook that they had been invited to meet Mayor Burnham to discuss various, turfy talking points, basically. Now, this has, of course, caused an outcry from the trans community, as up until this point, Mayor Burnham has in fact been a staunch ally to the community. However, in a statement released late on the 12th of February, Mayor Burnham claimed that he did not invite the LGB Alliance and was actually approached by a group who claimed to be party members, and that he had no idea that they were members of the LGB Alliance. So in the statement that was released, it said, the mayor was contacted by a group who identified themselves as Labour Party women, senior academics and lawyers, requesting a meeting to discuss the issues arising from the GRA proposals, GRA, Gender Recognition Act. There was no mention in this letter of the LGB Alliance. So Mayor Burnham's statement then went on to say that meetings do not indicate support for any individual or group, but the mayor continues to support the changes proposed to the Gender Recognition Act. So what are your thoughts on this particular one, Michelle?
Well, this is a strange one because you and I have both interviewed Andy Burnham, and I was there recording and watching his speech at Sparkle, and obviously you have to take everything that a politician says with a pinch of salt, but overall, as much as I was able to, I believed him. And I know that the LGB Alliance are famous for being a bunch of lying fuckwads about almost everything, so I think that Burnham is on the level here. I don't think he's trying to cover his tracks, and I can totally see the LGB Alliance pulling this kind of shit and then spinning it into, look, the Mayor of Manchester's inviting us in, we're doing well, aren't we? When actually, they asked him.
Yeah.
And didn't even say they were the LGB Alliance.
Indeed, which seems to be, I think that's the crux of the whole thing, really, because a lot of the, the discourse that I saw on Twitter was about, why would you meet with the LGB Alliance? Do you meet with other hate groups? Do you meet with the BNP and whatever else? Why are this lot so special? And it would seem that their, lack of truth, not being terribly forthcoming with who they were and what organisation they were representing, seems to have been the crux of it, which is very interesting. And I'm sure some people are getting shouted at Manchester Town Hall at this very moment. But I am inclined to agree with you because the embarrassing thing is I keep running into Andy Burnham because, there are events that people go to and you kind of, so when I actually bumped into Andy Burnham at Pride, back in August, we were all preparing to go off for the parade and he was just there giving an interview to the BBC. It's like, oh, there he is again. So he's, visibly...
Well, he's your mayor, isn't he?
He is indeed, yes. And he's visibly supporting not just the trans community, but the whole LGBT community. Manchester has the village. It would be very, very silly politically for him or anyone who is the mayor of Manchester to come out with something that's homophobic or transphobic, because that shit just wouldn't fly, unfortunately, which is incidentally what they said to the inventor of the very first feces-powered helicopter. So, yes, there was a lot of conversation about this on Twitter and, other social media and people saying Andy Burnham's a secret TERF. I don't think that's the case. However, I have been surprised and disappointed by, developments in the political sphere before, so we shall see. So, yes, that was a thing that happened, a little bit unfortunate. I specifically will be keeping a bit of an eye on this, and if I ever bump into him again, I'll be sure to ask him about it. However, let us move on to the next little bit of this, which we have entitled Glinner Chicken Fucknuts. Yeah, finally, something actually pretty funny happened. Admittedly, after a whole heap of really bad stuff, but arch anti-trans goblin man and former comedy writer Graham Linehan finally went full bigot and wrote a piece for the Mail on Sunday that can only be described as the hateful ramblings of a man who has long since lost his cultural relevance. It was the usual bunch of lies and nonsense that we have no interest in going into because fuck him and the things that he says, but he then went on to appear in a piece in the Sunday Times, more alarm bells ringing there, where he claimed that he was the most hated man on the internet, and moaned about how he has lost work as a result of him, as a result of him choosing to be a prick about trans people all the livelong day on Twitter. Someone did an analysis of this. For 3 days straight, he tweeted something about trans people every 5 minutes. It's like, dude, you are obsessed. So, as a result of all of this, BBC's Newsnight decided to have Linehan on to talk about his role in the transgender debate, and it was actually pretty glorious. All the way through, Newsnight journalist and presenter Sarah Smith challenged Linehan's various takes on, for example, how treating trans kids is a bit like human experimentation and murder on children by the Nazis during the Second World War. Apparently those two things are very similar, and why he thinks his involvement in this quote-unquote debate isn't toxic. And in the face of this fairly, light level of criticism, he completely fucking crumbled. It was enough to lighten up my blackened little heart, and I do urge you to check it out. We have posted the full interview on our YouTube, the link for which in the description. Obviously, trigger warnings for transphobia, attempted transphobia, thwarted transphobia, references to the Nazis, and of course, Graham Linehan. Or to give him his full medical title, Graham Linehan. But only if you have the spoons for it. Check it out, because it definitely cheered us up. We also made a supercut of the interview itself, which was actually just him saying, I shouldn't really be involved in this, and then Sarah Smith ending the interview, which is really all it should have been. 18 seconds, tells you everything you need to know. So the piece in Newsnight particularly was not about trans rights in itself, as an issue, that exists. It was about Graham Linehan being a dick online. Obviously, that should never have been a thing. He shouldn't have been invited on television to talk about how much of a dick he is online. And it's only a thing because he is already a famous man. Or was, I guess. So the thing is, admittedly, he very much fouled his nest on television, which was hilarious to see. But the fact is, the piece in itself shouldn't have happened. In spite of how badly it went for Linehan, because you just shouldn't platform bigots. So, people, the Mumsnet crowd, the Prosecco Mafia, Prosecco Stormfront, that was it, are saying that, and actually being quite misogynistic towards Sarah Smith, saying, stupid woman trying to interrupt Graham, kind of thing, insisting that the BBC was not being balanced and not being impartial, which is, interestingly, precisely what we say about them, so, there you go. Crazy thing, sometimes you're thrusting in the same direction. But I don't understand why they decided to give him a platform. Yes, admittedly, it went kind of hilariously, but some people will have been swayed by it. Some people will have watched it and thought, well, they didn't really let him speak, which they very much did, actually, and that was the hilarious part.
Yeah, he did gain 1,000 followers on Twitter afterwards.
Yeah, but after losing however many thousand over the preceding few months for being completely fucking unhinged. So
exactly. His rhetoric is on the whole a losing one when it comes to getting people on side, but he is sort of becoming a focal point of the TERF community so that everyone's following him, so he can sort of send out information and dictate things. And even with his followership losing 100,000 followers since he started this campaign 2 years ago, he still has 600,000 people. That's higher numbers than the circulation for the Daily Mirror. So that should give you pause. that this man is indeed a very, very dangerous enemy of the transgender community, and I think the policy should be to report every single tweet he does as much as possible, because hopefully one of them will take and he'll get kicked off the platform, because you take away his Twitter, he has no power anymore. He has to go off to fucking Mumsnet or Spinster or any other number of turf holes that no one other than trans haters goes to.
I do wonder why he's so obsessed and what started this, and there's a number of theories about that, which I'm not going to go into, but
I would like to dispel one of them, because there is a theory out there that he was going around and leching on trans people and then got rejected, and that is not the case. I spoke to Secret Gamer Girl. You can follow her on Twitter under Secret Gamer Girl, and she basically did this whole big thread on how people have been saying that Graham Linehan came onto her, and she said quite rightly that it's kind of gross, and that's not what happened, that they were basically at most online friends and then eventually sort of fell away from each other because Graham Linehan turned anti-trans. So that is one myth I would like to dispel right here, right now. There are many other theories behind it, but I think my personal one is this is about ego.
Seemingly, because there's no sort of other logical reason, really. There's like a cis man who is not himself LGBT, he's not involved in the LGBT community or in any of its campaigning or anything. You know, he's a guy who wrote a few television shows that were vaguely amusing. I never did like the IT crowd, to be honest. Anyway, why then has he appointed himself king of the lesbians and feels the need to kind of stride over this debate? You know, like he's got any kind of skin in the game, which he doesn't. Why are people listening to him? And it's because he's coming out with all of the nasty shit that, he's telling it how it really is. He's telling the truth and he's being suppressed by the BBC. Yes, he's being silenced by being invited to write for the Daily Mail, the Times, and be on Newsnight. God, how silenced is that?
I know,
I
right?
would like to be that silenced, frankly. Could do a lot of good if I was that silenced.
Here's the thing, though. During Gamergate, many years ago, for people who don't know Gamergate, a bunch of men's rights activists and stuff basically got pissed off that women were making games. That's what it was about. Graham Linehan, to his credit at the time, got involved in a big way, and he was tweeting about Gamergate all day, every day, trying to support the victims of that hateful movement. And I think something clicked in him then, or maybe even before that, where he liked that he was seen as a hero, which at the time, arguably, he kind of was, and has since then been chasing similar things to feed that rush he gets. And he moved on to the whole thing about abortion access in Ireland. He was a big voice in that. That was his next thing. Then it became trans people once that wrapped up. He's basically in on this to try and feed his ego.
I can't think of another reason, really, unless, something emerges in the next few years. But, whatever. But particularly interesting that he was kind of a hero, as it were, of Gamergate, because, of course, a couple of the people involved who were on the receiving end of a lot of that nastiness and misogyny from those men's rights activists were themselves trans.
Yeah, and he supported those trans people. Like, Secret Gamer Girl showed me some tweets and stuff where it's just like, what the fuck happened to Graham Linehan in 2017 when he started this shit? But anyway, I think we've covered every angle of this prick. I'm kind of done.
That's enough of that. Yeah, I think I'm kind of done. Wish he was, obviously, but sadly I don't think so. So now we come to the meat of the episode, and unfortunately it isn't a fun one because we turn to the United States of America. Remember, that place that elected that fucking guy and he's been suffering for it ever since. Late last year, American news outlets began reporting on the custody battle over Luna Younger, a Texas trans kid. Now, according to the various reports, Luna's father was adamant that she is not trans, whilst her mother was supportive of her daughter's gender identity, and this very quickly became the main focus of the custody hearing, and it was framed by various news outlets as either a father trying to stop a mother from inflicting transness on their kid, or as a mother trying to save Luna from being forced to live as something that she isn't. Now, according to Caitlin Byrne's report on the issue in Vox, which is linked in the description, so I would suggest having a read of it, this case is very much in the latter camp, and in late October, a jury agreed and granted Luna's mother full custody. Woo! But then 2 days later, the judge in the case decided to throw that out and grant joint custody, leaving Luna in the position of only being able to be herself half of the time. This case appears to have been the starting pistol for an alarming number of state bills that seek to criminalise medical treatments for gender dysphoria in under 18s. Currently, the states of Kentucky, South Carolina, Colorado, Oklahoma, Illinois, Florida, and Missouri all have Republican lawmakers who have tabled bills seeking to not just ban treatments, but to actually criminalize doctors who attempt to treat trans youth. New Hampshire also has a bill on the table, but this one only seeks to classify accepting the gender identity of trans kids as child abuse. So that's not so bad. Now, there is some good news in that there was a bill in South Dakota tabled by Republican lawmakers. They had tried to get their own bill through, but thankfully this has now been killed off. South Dakota's bill is dead.
Way!
Yeah, good news. Now, it's important to note for our British listeners that these bills will only apply to the states themselves. In the US, there are two kinds of laws, federal, which apply nationwide, and state laws, which apply only in the particular state. So you have the House and the Senate in Washington that sorts out federal laws, while each state has their own House and Senate where they come up with their own stuff. Which is why something like cannabis possession can be legal in somewhere like California, but also illegal in the whole of the United States at the same time. As Californian state law has legalized cannabis where it is still illegal under federal law. Technically, federal laws do trump state laws, so in theory, the federal government have the right to march in and shut down the cannabis industry in California, but have chosen for the moment to let things slide. So that is the situation, and to go into this and discuss it, we are joined by Molly Woodstock, a journalist based in Oregon and the host of the awesome Gender Reveal podcast. Also joining us is Cassius Adair, a scholar and radio producer living in Virginia in the American South. He's got a PhD in English, focusing on trans and legal narratives, and he's working on a new trans activism podcast called Transcripts, which will be out in June. They are also the founders of Sylvion Consulting, a media consultancy company that aims to help facilitate better media coverage of the transgender community. So, all good. Welcome to the show, Molly and Cassius.
Hi, thanks so much for having us.
Hello.
Oh, my pleasure. It's better to speak to somebody who is actually there rather than...
Like, we could guess. We've seen a lot of movies, but it won't be the same.
It's exactly the same.
Yeah,
if you've
yeah.
seen Clueless, you know America.
Fair enough. So if I could, just for clarity for the audience, if we could do pronouns, please.
Yeah, my pronouns are they, them.
And I'm Cassius, and I use he, him, his.
Okay, so starting with you, Molly, if I could just ask, what tends to be the general culture in these particular states when it comes to LGBT equality and indeed trans issues?
It might actually make more sense to punt this one over to Cassius because I live in Oregon, which is relatively... For the United States, the city that I live in is one of the most trans-friendly cities in the United States. And so I think Cassius might have a better idea than I do. I do know that the states that you listed are not generally amongst the most friendly to LGBTQ issues, but also all of those states that you listed have really different politics, and cities within those states have really different politics. And so we'll see, even in states like North Carolina, which is famous in these states for passing one particularly horrific form of trans discrimination, there are cities within North Carolina that are very trans friendly. And so I think it's hard to generalize, but I still would love to punt this question away from me.
Fair enough.
I think this kind of question is kind of like somebody asking us, so what is the general culture around LGBT equality in Spain, Portugal, Germany, and France?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, if I may, I think what's really interesting about this list to me is that some of these states, if you were to say, oh yeah, what are the states most likely to pass like transphobic legislation? I'd be like, yeah, Kentucky, that seems right to me. South Dakota, that seems right to me. But also like Colorado and Florida and Illinois don't seem to me to be obviously in the camp of like very conservative legislatures that have a lot of energy behind social movement politics driving the state legislatures. So I'm quite curious about this list, and it makes me feel like there's probably individual legislatures in those states, or legislators rather, in those states who have made this part of their personal election agenda, because I don't see like Illinois, which is where Chicago is, usually leading the way on transphobic legislation, whereas it makes more sense for me, just bit of my commonplace understanding of regional politics, to see some of these other states like South Dakota maybe, or Kentucky. And as Molly was pointing out, like in almost all of these states, you have particular areas or regions that are more progressive, that are in tension with the larger state legislatures, because our legislators are based on geographical distribution. as well as by proportional distribution. You'll have some houses that will be very controlled by one party because of the way those district lines are drawn. So it's complicated to say in any U.S. context, whether that's federal or state, what a particular geographical region feels about something, because there's a lot of control that individual state legislators have to draw the lines around who elects them and to draw those lines in such a way that favors one dominant party. So there's a little bit of like technical stuff here that affects how we ask or answer that question. But I think that this list of states reflects a little bit of a surprise to me. It isn't the states that I would say are the most likely to have far right or evangelical control of their legislatures. So it seems that there's probably individual politicians who are like, this is how I will make my name, and this is an issue I really care about that I need to bring to the floor, more than a concerted effort by like all of one particular state to lean in this direction.
Totally. And to that point, Colorado was on that list as a place in which someone, I don't know who, has proposed this anti-trans legislation. But also just last month, Colorado passed a new law that allows trans folks to obtain new birth certificates with new gender markers without any sort of proof of surgery or doctor's note. And so that is a law that actually passed in Colorado. And the fact that that law passed in Colorado last month makes me feel more confident that an anti-trans law won't pass in Colorado this month. I'm not saying I'm super confident because there's always space for people to be shitty, but I feel a little bit better about stuff like that.
Yeah, I've got a cousin who lives in Colorado, and when I was talking to him, he said that Colorado is a very sort of libertarian state in that
it is, yeah,
very much leave people to their own business. So it tracks that they would be cool with trans people getting the right documents. But yeah, I was surprised that Colorado was on the list and Alabama and Mississippi weren't. I mean, they may be concocting something, but like their particular brand of nasty politics is so famous, I know about it in the UK.
Right.
Like, that's how toxic their politics are. So I'm deeply surprised at some of the people on this list. You're very right.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that some of these states might have learned something about the backlash to some of the anti-gay policies and some of the anti-trans policies that were sort of coming out around 2004 and 5, which were a little bit more successful, but then led to some more liberal backlash. And then more recently around the bathroom bill stuff in North Carolina and some of the what was called then the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Indiana. So some of these states that are not on the list are states that have already tried to do anti-trans legislation and got massive backlash, especially from sort of like corporate entities saying like, we're not going to host our big basketball game or we're not going to put our big business in your state if you're doing this because it's like needlessly bad PR for us. And because corporations have so much influence in the states, you can tell that, like, at least from my sort of just sort of like guess about this, is that some of the states that are not trying this are states that have already seen that it's bad for business and are not going down that road right now. So that's part of my guess about who's not on the list and why.
Yeah, that was actually something that I read about at the time when House Bill 2, was that the North Dakota one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. HB 2 is in North Carolina, I think.
Oh,
or are you talking about the more recent one?
Yeah, North Carolina.
I knew it was a name of a state with a direction in it. Apologies. Yes, of course, it was North Carolina.
No, it's fine.
Because Charlotte, the city of Charlotte is in North Carolina, isn't it? And so there were several multinational corporations who were based or had offices there who said, no, we're not going to do this. That was something that even came up in the coverage of all of this since it started, really. That has cropped up in the press, even in the UK. So that's interesting, isn't it? That's definitely leaning into capitalist interests, but in a way that's actually not shit.
It's very interesting, yes.
Yeah. We have speculated, many have speculated, that the timing of all of these bills does seem to be a bit of a response to the case in Texas with Luna Younger and the custody battle. But it's also been speculated that this could be an attempt by the Republicans specifically to start, as it were, a culture war in the run-up to the presidential election. What's your take on that?
I don't personally know any Republican operatives as friends and family, but that seems to make sense to me, given my life experience of living in the United States. The playbook for this was really the Defense of Marriage amendments, which were put forth in individual state legislatures right before the 2004 election, which would have been the re-election of George W. Bush, which was highly contentious. And it would not surprise me, given the timing and the sort of way that these cultural issues can become strategic wedges on the right, and are trying to bait the left into overreaction, that this was part of a loosely coordinated attempt to make sure that trans issues were in the public eye, as opposed to things like healthcare and jobs and wages, which really are, the pocketbook issues for people, I think, actually do benefit a liberal or progressive perspective. But if people are not comfortable with trans people, it's easy to get people emotional about that, which is something they feel that they can control. Molly, do you have more on that?
Yeah, I mean, not particularly. Cassius articulated it a lot more thoughtfully than I was going to. I was just thinking that I think it's pretty clear that this is a strategy by Republicans to whip up conservative votes, because the only real alternate explanation for why you would go after trans kids is because you care about trans kids, right? Like, in their they propose that letting kids transition is harmful to them. And if they actually cared about kids who are trans, they would know that it's not harmful for them. So clearly they don't have trans kids' interests in heart. And so whose interests do they have at heart? It is obviously their own interest to get elected. It has nothing to do with actual trans kids. They are just like collateral damage in this election, which is absolutely terrible, because they're obviously one of the most vulnerable populations. Like, there's a reason that all of these states are going after trans kids versus trans adults, and it's because trans kids can't speak out for their own rights and be seen with even as much authority as trans adults are given, which is basically none, because obviously we aren't seen as human either, but we're seen as slightly more human than trans kids. And so they're really going after people that are the least able to defend themselves as a political issue, as a political campaign point, rather than for anyone's well-being whatsoever.
It's interesting when you said that they may believe that they are trying to protect trans kids, and with some of the names of these bills that have been floating around, that seems to be the case. Like, South Carolina has the Youth Gender Reassignment Prevention Act, which is the phrasing, the Prevention Act. That's usually the kind of thing that follows something bad contextually.
Yeah, violence or something.
Yeah, exactly. And then Florida, you've got the Vulnerable Child Protection Act, which on the surface is just like, well, we should protect vulnerable children. But in their eyes, a vulnerable child is a child being forced into transness when that isn't a thing.
Ever.
If anything, a trans kid is vulnerable because they maybe aren't allowed to transition. And then you get to the absurdly hyperbolic end with protect minors from mutilation and sterilization. That's the name of the act in Colorado, which
Seems chill.
yeah, it seems totally chill.
Yeah, absolutely. No, nothing to read into there.
Yeah, so it's either like they genuinely believe they want to protect trans kids from being trans because they see transness as dangerous, or they want to put that out there. They want to put the message out there that to be trans is something that is inflicted on people.
Right, exactly. And they're naming things like the Vulnerable Child Protection Act, so that when kids speak up and say, no, actually, I am trans and this is good for me, they can say, oh, no, you poor vulnerable child, you have been manipulated into believing this. But South Dakota's bill, which was just struck down, as you mentioned, was also called something like the Vulnerable Child Protection Act, and I'm sure a lot of these were also called things like that, which is wild, because if you look at the Luna Younger case, like, what is more damaging to a child than having them have to switch genders every time they go to a parent's house? Like, that is so much more damaging to a child than letting them grow their hair out and, use a different name and pronouns for a while.
I was going to say, too, that this type of fusion of bill names and political propaganda is really common, and it really reflects the same tactics that are used by people who are anti-abortion in the United States, because abortion restriction legislation is almost always framed as protecting vulnerable women or vulnerable babies, and they mean by babies here like fetuses, right? And so the articulation of the vulnerable child as the thing that we all need to be organized around saving is a really common maneuver around, especially like religious oriented, but even not religious oriented right-wing political movements. And so to me, when I see those bills, I'm like, yeah, like they hired the same person to name those bills as names the like, protect vulnerable babies, from hypothetical third trimester abortions that if they happen are happening because of like extreme medical necessity and are not happening out of malice. But at any rate, it's the same type of emotional tactics that are used to position people who have abortions as harming vulnerable children. It's the same way that healthcare providers are being positioned as the bad guys who are harming vulnerable trans kids. So it's this sort of strange way to frame bodily autonomy as somehow doing harm to others or oneself, and the state as that which is the protector of those vulnerable subjects, which is like really wild because like when has a right-wing state ever been like, yes, we are effectively protecting women and trans people? but that's the argument. Yeah.
Given the number of trans people who've been convicted of actually doing harm like that is vanishingly small, I think 0, as opposed to the number of Republican senators and lawmakers who've been convicted of something like that is really, really high. So to me, if you want to protect vulnerable children, keep them away from your right-wing politicians. But that's a bit of lateral thinking that probably didn't really occur to them. So
you really are on a mission to alienate the tiny amount of right-wing listeners we have, Ash, and I am for it.
Yes, I am.
I am well in on that.
Yeah, well, it's like, would anybody who supports any measure like this, who actually swallows this rhetoric, how can you... Oh, no, I'm not even going to get into it, all right? Let's just... I know what we've talked about in terms of, I guess, culture war stuff and using it as a wedge issue, which is absolutely what's happening. It's happening here in the UK too. Do you see trans issues actually becoming a bigger deal during this presidential election campaign?
I don't think people care enough about trans people, but Cassius, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that this is a hard question to answer. I think that the people who want to go forth and make trans issues per se, like sort of under that designation, a big issue, are really not trans people at this moment. I think that trans people, from what I see in my communities, are organized around the same type of issues that a lot of people in the United States are organized around and are not necessarily calling them trans issues. So like things like fair wages or fair housing or access to medical care or immigration justice or anti-racism, like the trans people in my communities are really focused on those macro issues, and they don't need to call them like trans issues in order to advocate for them as trans people and trans activists. So like the trans folks that I know who are working on things like healthcare access agree that the whole United States healthcare system is what hurts trans people, right? Not just like particular trans exclusions on individual healthcare policies, of which there are many in the United States. So from my perspective, like trans people themselves are interested in having larger conversations about justice and are not like, hey, I'm only going to vote for you if you say nice things about me and my pronouns or whatever. The people who are really trying to make trans issues a major deal tend to be, in my like sort of estimation or in my worldview, those people who are using them to harm trans people and trying to make trans people into something that's very frightening and alien to voters and something that feels like, these are some outsiders who are not in your community and they're going to force you to do something different. When actually we know that trans people live all across the United States. There are more LGBT and trans identified people in the US South per capita than in a lot of other places. So like even in places that are sort of stereotyped as right wing or like conservative places where like, that purportedly has this type of conservative monoculture, that's not true. And so like trans people are not actually scary outsiders. They're people in everybody's neighborhoods, and they also care about like being able to afford healthcare. and if we told the truth about that, I think our politics would look really different.
Yeah, to play off of that, I make this podcast called Gender Reveal, and the last 2 episodes were with Paige Kreisman and Alyssa Pariah, and both of those people are trans women who are Democratic Socialist organizers. Paige is running for state office. Alyssa is organizing. And like I said, both of them are trans, and we spend the entire podcast talking about issues that they are pushing, and neither of them are really focused on any issue that solely benefits trans people. Both of them are working on Medicare for all. They're working on labor organizing. They're working on affordable housing. They're working on climate change. And I think, like, on a local level, there are squabbles over trans legislation like the ones we just talked about, and perhaps on a state level as well. But on a federal level, no one is proposing anything either way. And so I find it hard to imagine that trans people will be considered an issue in the federal election, because I don't understand what the debate would be. We don't have any rights to take away, really. And no one is proposing on a national level that we are given any kind of rights. And so I don't know what the discussion would be. I think the only way that they will come up is that whoever the Democratic nominee is will try to pander to trans people and will fail, because no politician knows how to talk about trans people, even the ones that try mess it up. And, you know, Trump might have some sort of throwaway line about how scary and terrible trans people are, but our rights aren't really being discussed. So like Cassius said, I think the real like trans issues that are coming up are just healthcare, housing, education, employment, things like that.
The thing about the U.S. federal elections, too, is that they happen state by state because of the Electoral College, which is weird. And so, like, I guess if you can convince, like, everybody in Texas that, like, trans people are really good, and so suddenly you have to, like, get all the people in Texas to vote against the Republicans in order to support trans people or something, then that could sway a federal election, because it's like a big state and there's a lot of votes there or whatever. But like, so there maybe is some tactics around like having a state by state ground game here, but our political culture is so nationalized that it's like really hard for me to imagine someone voting for or against Donald Trump on the basis of like a trans state legislature ruling like that.
Right.
This feels like getting your voters like really excited who are already your voters and making sure that you lock in the states that are yours. But I don't know, whoever is like getting paid to do the political consulting that's saying like, hey, we're really going to help Donald Trump by like making sure everyone's mad about trans people right now, I feel like that person is being overpaid.
True.
One thing that I thought was a possibility, although admittedly I'm in the UK, I've only been to America, like Disney America, like Florida and Texas to see my cousin, but that was in Austin, so that's...
Yeah, it's also Disney, yeah.
So yeah, I was looking into all this stuff, and I'm not any kind of expert on it, but I had a theory that once the Supreme Court decides on the case of Amy Stevens, who is taking her previous employer to task over being sacked for wanting to wear the female uniform, I thought that when that decision comes down, I could see Republicans using that as a rallying cry for their base, and then suddenly trans issues being propelled into the public consciousness, and suddenly it would be a thing asked of both candidates and anyone in the periphery. Do you think that is a likely scenario, or have I just imagined it?
I don't know if that's unlikely. I'm not sure right now what the public awareness is outside of trans communities of that particular case, and I think it just depends on how quick both sides are to like leverage their talking points about that. It doesn't feel like I don't know. I'm not sure how much people like. I think that Molly's exactly right. I don't know how much people care about trans people. It's really hard to tell right now. Molly, do you have a sense of that?
I really don't think that anyone is going to be swayed on the federal level by almost anything, but certainly not what candidates think about trans people. Like Trump will do everything he can to destroy trans people's livelihood without actually putting any effort into it. And whoever the Democratic candidate will be will say, oh, yes, trans people should have rights. And that's how it's going to be. And I don't think it's going to be much of a rallying point, so much as maybe, yes, there will be a debate question on it, but I don't think it's really going to change anything, because I think that so many of us in America are so desperate to have healthcare and jobs and housing that those are really the issues that people are focusing on right now.
Yeah, those are big issues. Like, you've literally got a crypto-fascist criminal right now in the White House. I think that's probably going to come up a damn sight more than just some random transport person being able to get hormones on Medicare.
Right.
That's the problem as well that we have with our own sack of shit in number 10, unfortunately, in that, so there was the opposition, the Labour Party, had their, like, a debate for who potentially will be in charge of the Labour Party, which was great. All of the candidates got a question about trans rights, but there was immediately a backlash to this, including apparently one as yet unnamed shadow cabinet minister who said that, well, actually, my constituents don't give a shit about trans rights. And that's not very surprising. I don't think it is a swing vote for anybody but to the trans community. But that is something that we do pay attention to. But as has been pointed out before, the percentage of trans people compared to the general population, pretty small, actually.
Right.
So, not necessarily going to have a tremendous impact when it comes to election time.
Yeah.
That does remind me that the billionaire Michael Bloomberg, who is sort of running this weird, hard to define campaign for the Democratic nomination that involves not actually participating in anything that traditionally is involved in running for the Democratic nomination and instead just spending billions of dollars on ads, he was recently exposed as having said very transphobic things, and that audio clip is going around on Twitter. But I think it's just an instance of trans people on twitter.com sharing that clip and being like, oh, isn't this terrible? I can't see it actually like affecting anyone's chance at anything because like our numbers simply aren't big enough to really have sway over anything.
Yeah. I think we're more likely to be like helpful contributors to political movements than to be determiners of votes, right? So it's like, I know so many trans people who are out there like trying to get Bernie Sanders elected or working in like socialist campaigns, trying to get like healthcare, or like when I was working on like union bargaining, we were able to put trans healthcare on the platform along with lots of other healthcare issues because we were framing it as like trans equity for all workers. Like everybody deserves to have healthcare that makes sense. And that was persuasive. But I wasn't like my colleagues were like, the number one issue for us is winning trans healthcare. It was like the number one issue for us is making sure that we all have healthcare that works for us. And I think that like both trans, like I think that trans people are like looking for candidates who also kind of get that, because right now politically, I think if a candidate was going to go out of their way and be like, we're going to save all the trans people from violence, I'd be like, no, you're not. You don't actually know anything.
That's not how that works.
Yeah.
Right. And I was, sorry to tie it back to gender reveal, but I was talking with Paige on gender reveal about how even states in the United States that have quote unquote progressive legislation and quote unquote like trans affirming legislation are still failing trans people. Like Oregon has some of the most progressive healthcare for trans folks, and it is still failing trans people. And so, yeah, I don't trust any cis politician that thinks that they actually know how to help trans people. That doesn't mean I wouldn't take them over people who are overtly transphobic, but I don't trust them to actually help us in like any meaningful way besides pursuing legislation that like we've all been saying helps everyone, such as Medicare for All.
What can our listeners do here in the UK to help fight these anti-trans youth bills that are cropping up? Is there anything that we can do?
I mean, I don't really have anything because there's not even really anything that I can do in Oregon on most of this stuff. It's like very state by state. And if you are not a resident of that particular state, legislators often won't listen to you if you try to like have a public comment. And I don't know enough about each individual bill to know if there's really anything else that can be done other than being boots on the ground in that particular state. It's, if it was a political race, I would suggest that folks donate money to whoever, you know, the least shitty candidate was. But in cases like these bills, like there's not much to be done if you're not really living in that state or living on the ground. But maybe Cassius knows something.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have relatives and friends and family that you can get active in those states, I think that's harder. But like, I don't know, I think that Molly and I are both on the like just give money to trans people so that they can survive whatever is coming next train. Like I think that like I've been talking to a lot of folks about like the ideas about mutual aid and community support, and like the reality is that like a lot of these bills are going to codify bad stuff that's already happening. Or in the case of like anti-discrimination legislation, they're going to make it like pretty much exactly the same things are going to happen, but you're going to have to go through a legal process to prove that they're happening to you before you can get any recompense. And like both of those things are extremely burdensome on trans people. And the reality is that like if we didn't have to like engage, like if the difference between dealing with these state actors and not dealing with them wasn't like life or death for people, then like things would be a lot better for everyone and we wouldn't have to like spend all of our time on the defensive. And so like if people are asking like, you know, in the same way that like you might ask me like what can I do to help you in the UK, like yeah, I can like signal boost like people who are doing activism against the sort of resurgence of like TERF discourse and anti-trans discourse, but like it's probably like in the day-to-day world more valuable for us to continue the like transnational like PayPaling of each other $20 to help each other.
Passing the same $20 around.
Exactly, to keep passing the same $20 around, yeah.
GoFundMe definitely are making a lot of money off that same $20.
Absolutely.
Like they seem to be propping up the entire like trans medical industry, I guess.
Exactly. I know, like I don't know what the conversion rate is to GBP, but whatever it is, like it's
probably a bit rubbish by this point.
Probably bad, yeah. But whatever it is, I mean, I don't know. I think that like sometimes we get over invested in particular bills that sometimes they don't even have a chance of passing. They're just being introduced in order to get a lot of media coverage and get people really hyped up. And I think that the best thing we can do is like think rationally about like how many of these bills are going to pass, how many people's lives are actually going to be affected. And then if those bills are not actually going to do that much, or if they're just there so that one politician can cut an ad that was like, I tried to protect vulnerable children in our state and then the liberals wouldn't let me. Like, I don't care about spending all of my energy making sure that person can't cut that ad because they're going to cut it whether it passes or not, right? Like, that's their goal. And so I would rather spend my political energy being like, okay, like, who needs those $20? Let's
help each other out.
Yeah.
You're right. I believe you're absolutely right. I think there's only so much you can do when you feel like you're entirely on the defensive. And so where we're supporting each other, as the trans community is wont to do, is going to have to carry on, because that's not going away. And, you know, the government's not going to fucking help out, so we're going to do it ourselves. Well, thank you both for joining us for this possibly one of the more depressing conversations we've had on the podcast.
Oh my God. We bring the depression energy. Yeah.
I think that it is more hopeful than it appears on its face in that the South Dakota legislation was killed in committee. It didn't even go to the Senate for a full vote. And if that kind of bill is getting killed 5-2 in South Dakota, there is a really good chance that a lot of these other states that are proposing these really harmful bills that are really scary and which I will not be breathing easy until they are all also killed as bills. I still think that it is a good sign that these bills are maybe being proposed by individual legislators who just love to destroy trans kids as a political tactic, but that it doesn't seem like they're necessarily going to be getting enough traction to actually be enacted.
I agree. I think I'm just being overly cynical for clout, but
you can't go wrong being cynical. Yeah.
I just think also like the reason that there are more and more trans bills or anti-trans bills going through is that trans people are more on a national radar, right? And so this is a necessary step into trans equity, if such a thing were ever to exist, because before there weren't a lot of anti-trans bills being passed because no one knew that trans people existed or should have any rights at all. And so this is like a very, very shitty but somewhat necessary step towards obtaining basic human rights. What a thought. Imagine.
Well, yeah, yes, genuinely though, thank you both for joining us and chatting this out with us and giving us that insight actually from America instead of Michelle and I on this side of the Atlantic saying, gosh, isn't the news terrible?
Yeah, if it was just us two, it would not have gone this way. We would have been reacting in horror, I think, because I think that this kind of issue does cut to the core of trans people because, like, this isn't always the case, but I think a lot of trans people were also very trans kids. So it does go to the heart of us. But anyway, thank you so much for joining us, both of you. If you'd like to plug anything, now's your chance. Where can people find you online? Is there anything that people should check out that you do?
Gosh, just go.
Oh, I was hoping that you would go first because you have more
I can go.
impressive stuff.
Mine's just so long. Okay,
Everyone's so polite.
Okay, I'm going first. So I make a podcast called Gender Reveal, which is about trans people. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. I am on Twitter and Instagram. Gender Reveal's on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at mollywoodstock.com, genderpodcast.com. and patreon.com/gender if you want to fund transmedia. But I mean, I don't know. Do y'all have a Patreon that I should be on as well? Because I don't want to take over as the transmedia to pay.
Well, we do have a Patreon, but we're very, very relaxed about it to the point where I established it, then we forgot it existed for 8 months until like our listeners found it and started donating. We're like, we did that.
Yeah.
All right, so
all right.
support this podcast first, but then if you have additional money to support transmedia, you can support Gender Reveal as well. And then Cassius and I have a trans consulting company called Sylveon Consulting, and folks can hire us to help them be less shitty to trans people. How do you describe our company?
Kind of like that. I'll go ahead and just sort of loop back to the how do we describe our company. I am on Twitter at Cassius A, which is CASSIUS_A. I am an independent scholar and producer, so if you Google me, you might find like some things I'm not embarrassed by and some things I'm kind of embarrassed by. Like my entire dissertation is on the internet and you don't have to read it. I am also just about to launch a pilot podcast or a pilot for a podcast with the University of Minnesota Treader Trans Oral History Project, which is an amazing project.
That sounds cool.
Collecting stories of trans people, and the podcast will be called Transcripts, and we're hoping to drop a pilot in June. We do have funding for that pilot, so I would suggest that your listeners pay you all and Molly first before they pay me, but we will at some point have a mechanism for people to support that work as well. And yeah, our little consulting company, I should say our big, important consulting company,
Thank you so much.
is the two of us. We specialize in like making trans narratives work for trans people in various capacities. So we work with individual writers and podcasters and journalists, as well as organizations and companies, and Molly does more workplace equity stuff, but we both do a lot of work trying to make sure that the stories that are told about trans people have any relationship to what's going on in trans people's lives. So that's our pitch.
Awesome. So make sure you go check all of that out. All of the links for all of the various things will be in the description. I highly recommend that you check out Gender Reveal because it is a mainstay of my subscriptions. I do really like the show a lot, and you can learn a lot from it. And anyway, let's do this ending of the show business thing that I was supposed to be doing and then got sidetracked with fangirling. So, thanks for listening. Check us out on social media, that thing you do every day that ruins every day. You can check us out on facebook.com/whatthetrans. You can get us on Twitter at whatthetrans. You can get us on our new .com website, whatthetrans.com. We have one of those now. We're officially a thing. And you can also donate to our Patreon if you like. Patreon.com/whatthetrans. We don't really have anything to give you if you do. We have one tier of £1 a month, but, you know, every little helps, so thanks so very much. And we'd also like to make space to thank all of our patrons, all of our lovely patrons.
You're a sexy bunch, starting with Alexandra Lilly,
Anthony Pena,
April Heller,
Becky Scott Farley,
Bernard's Pink Jelly Bean.
God, I love Bernard's Pink Jelly Bean.
So do I.
Chris Hubley,
Lauren O'Nyines,
Lanus,
Maddie Bell,
Matt Reynolds,
Sophie Lewis,
and to our new patrons, Chocolate Eclair,
Ian Coomer,
Melissa Brooks,
Karakan12,
and Laker. Thank you so much for your support. That will go to hosting of the podcast, hosting of the website, and maybe if we get a little bit extra, go towards us traveling around the country to various prides when Pride season starts. Again, Cassius and Molly, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Of course, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
And you lovely listener, you will hear from us very soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.